Okay, cool. I think we will go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I noticed at least some of you were here last week. Was everybody here last week? Okay, cool. Totally fine. Welcome. Glad to have you join us. So if you were here last week we talked about SQL, and this week we are going to talk about none of the stuff we talked about last week, and we're just going to talk about Python, totally different topic. So totally fine if you weren't here last week. I would, since looks like we're going to be a small group today, I would love to do a quick just go around and let me know if you've ever done any Python before, and or if there's anything specific you're looking to get out of today, and maybe just refresh me on your name as well as we go around. Can I start right here?
Yeah. Alexandra.
Sweet. Welcome. All right, great.
Hi, Ruby. I don't have any prior experience with Python, but I learned a little bit about SQL last time. So
Amazing.
yes, I don't know if there's any relationship between these two, but I'm happy to.
We will talk about that today.
I'm Holly. I also before, but I did enjoy and not SQL, so I'm excited to see how that is.
Sweet. All right, cool.
5 months and I haven't done Python before.
Okay, very cool. Okay. Okay, that's cool. So you've done a little bit before, but maybe a while ago. Cool. Totally fine. Welcome. We're just doing a name and if you've used Python at all before.
I have no
Sweet. Great, you're in the right place. Okay, cool. Mostly totally new, which is perfect. So hopefully this will be good. I assume someone will shut the door from being too loud. Okay. Great. If you weren't here last week, make sure you go to this link here. This is going to be a pretty interactive session. So I'll be talking a bit, then we'll take breaks to kind of try it out yourselves. I can help troubleshoot, walk around, etc. And then we'll keep going. So we'll sort of go like that the whole session today. So make sure you're ready for that. If you were here last week, go ahead and go back to Hex. I think the same link will take you back to log in the same place you were last week. And if you're new, just go to that link, sign in with your USC email address. Hex is a kind of web-based tool for doing both SQL and Python, one or the other or both. It's super great. They've given it to us for free for you all. So shout out to them. This is also the real tool that I use in my day job. So I thought it would be cool for you all to see it in action and learn how it works. Just a quick introduction to me. I've been working in the data space for the last 10 years or so in a variety of spaces, nonprofit, consulting, media, universities, startups, and currently working in a podcasting technology startup where I use SQL, Python, Excel, and Hex every single day. So that's why I'm here teaching you all about this stuff. So go ahead and get signed in there, and I'll get us kicked off. Welcome. Awesome. All right. When you get settled, just go ahead and go to that link on the whiteboard and you can get signed in with your USC email. All right. So what are we going to talk about today? My objective for our session today is that you will leave here understanding what Python can do for data analysis, when might be a good time to use it as opposed to some of your other tools, SQL, Excel, anything else you might know. I'm going to show you how to read Python code, how to kind of understand what some Python is doing when you look at it, how to write and edit some simple Python code specifically for data analysis. That's going to be our focus for this session today. And also how to figure out what functions you need when you need them. So a little bit of teach you how to fish kind of thing, understand enough that you can go out and get what you need for specific projects you're working on or things you might work on in the future, internships, jobs, that kind of thing. So this is not going to be a class on comprehensive coding in Python. Okay, this is not a software engineering class. This is not how to write a whole app or website in Python. There's a whole other sort of category of knowledge that you can learn about that. I'm happy to point you to some resources if you're interested in that. I'm also not going to teach you every single little technicality of how to write great code in Python. I'm going to teach you how to write good enough code to do some data analysis tasks that you might want to do as a data analyst. Okay, that's our goal for today. As I said about SQL last week, Python is one of those things where if you know a tiny little bit, you are way ahead of somebody who knows none. So you can do a lot with Python with just a tiny little bit. And so that's where I'm trying to get you all both today and then in the next couple of weeks in this series. Hi, welcome. All right. So let's just start from the beginning. What is Python? Python is a programming language. Specifically, it's a programming language that's commonly used for scripting. Scripting is basically a word for writing a little bit of code for a specific task you're doing without building a whole website. You're not writing a whole app or application or, web-based thing. You're just writing the tiny bit of code that you need to get from point A to point B and what you need to do, which is extremely powerful. And it's great because it's way easier to learn than the whole comprehensive thing. Okay, so it's a great place for you to start, especially if you're newer to programming. Python is a fully featured programming language, so it is used by software engineers to write a lot of the technologies that you probably use every day. It's also very commonly used by kind of really intense data science, machine learning, that kind of stuff. It's also used by entry-level data analysts at all different kinds of positions. So it's very kind of multi-purpose. It's one of the easiest programming languages to learn outside of SQL. So this is a great place if you're newer to programming in general. It's a great place to get started. I was poking around on Python's website just to try to see if there were any fun tidbits for introducing it. And I liked this quote, which is from a guy from the Netherlands who's been involved in the development of Python. It's all about automating repetitive tasks, right? So that's exactly what we're going to be talking about today. When it's the sort of thing where when you notice you're sort of doing something repeatedly, or you need to do the same sort of set of actions on data over and over and over again, this is a really cool tool to make that so much faster for you. All right. So like I said, we're going to be primarily talking about Python for data analysis. There's a lot more stuff you can do with Python. I'm not going to talk about that today. Specifically, in Python, we have an idea called data frames, which is how we're going to interact with data. So I'm going to say that word a lot today. A data frame is basically just a table of data. So if you were in the SQL class last week, a SQL table, basically the same as a Python data frame. Very similar to, you could also think of it as an Excel spreadsheet, right? It's got columns, it's got rows, it may or may not have information in each sort of cell of the table. That's what a data frame is. Okay, so that's how we're going to be interacting with information using Python. So we can do all the basics with Python, right? We can create, import, export data frames. We can send them to other places, take them in from our sources. We can add to our data frames, edit them, change them into something else. We can summarize them, join them. If you know how to do pivot tables in Excel, we can do all that kind of stuff here, and a lot more, and in an automated way, which is super cool. Okay, so here's some examples of what Python scripts are used for. So again, a script is just a little tiny chunk of Python code that you're writing for a specific task. So everything we talked about in the SQL class last week, if you were here for the SQL class, every single thing we talked about, you can also do in Python. In my view, especially if you're just learning both of these things, all of that stuff is easier to do in SQL. So if you can do it in SQL, I would recommend that you do it in SQL. And when you get to the place where you can't quite do what you want to do, you need to do something more complicated, you switch to Python. That's why I love Hex as our tool, because it allows you to switch really easily. You can write some SQL to do something, write some Python to do something on that data you just spit out your data slightly differently, and then go back to SQL if the next thing you're doing is in SQL. Okay. Some other examples of things we could do. We can clean and format our data. So we can do some of this in SQL. We did this last week. Python can do all of that, plus a much wider variety of functions for cleaning and manipulating data. We'll get into functions a little bit more. Speaking of functions, you can run kind of any function on your data. So that could be anything from, we're going to take this column and multiply it all by 10. That's a simple function that you could do by hand on a piece of paper. You could do that with an Excel formula. You could do it in a SQL table. You can do it here. You can also do sort of much more complicated versions of that in Python. So you can write functions that do much more involved levels of transformation and apply them to your data. Something that's also really helpful about data frames specifically is you can extract data for display. So if you want to be able to pull out specific points of your data, you want to be able to summarize, like, all right, I'd like to be able to like filter by this and then pull out the average if it meets these conditions and then display that in my dashboard at the end. That's exactly the type of thing that's very easy to do in Python. That's a little tedious to do in SQL. So that's a good case where you want to switch over to Python. And it's also great for preparing data for use in SQL. So just in general, SQL is a little easier to use than Python, and it's more well-known. There are more people in the world who know how to write basic SQL than basic Python. So if you're the one doing data stuff and you know a little bit of both, you can do some of the sort of steps that have to be done in Python, and then other people can kind of pick up from there and do SQL. All right. More broadly, what are Python scripts used for? It's when you're thinking to yourself, there's got to be a better way to do this. Okay, there's so many jobs or roles that you might be in where you're sort of asked to sort of make a monthly Excel report of, how the marketing campaign is going or the sales performance or, any different number of things. A lot of those types of tasks can be done in a tool like Hex using tools like SQL and Python, so that you're not doing like, all right, on the first of the month, I got to copy paste these 4 columns from this other source. And then I got to do this. And then I got to make the pivot table. And you have those like list of notes for yourself. Those are exactly the type of things where like the 3rd month in a row that you're doing the same thing, you're thinking there's got to be a better way to do this. This is often the tool. And that's been the case in my experience. Okay. All right. So I've talked a lot about Hex. If you were here last week, you know what Hex is. So Hex is basically a notebook tool. So you might encounter this concept notebook if you've ever like dabbled in learning programming before. There's a few other tools that do this. A notebook essentially allows you to write a little bit of code, run it right away, see what it spits out, and then you can write more code kind of below it. So it's a great kind of learning tool. It's a great sort of like show your work, see what's going on. And we can alternate, as I mentioned, between Python and SQL. So here's an example. This is exactly what we're going to do next week. We'll do the Python parts of this today. You might use some Python functions to load your data. You might write some SQL to join your data together, do some other stuff. Python, you might do some text analysis. That's hard to do in SQL, so we'd switch to Python for that. And then it's got some built-in visualization tools. Python also has some visualization tools, so you can use those as well. So it's a great kind of like mix and match, use the tool that's right for what you want without having to switch out of it to a different interface. Okay. All right, so first thing we're going to do is make sure everybody can get into Hex. So everybody should be on that link and signed in with your USC email. You should see under projects in there. Let me show you what that looks like. You should see some sort of screen like this. You're going to want to go to projects on the left. If it's your first time logging in, you're going to have to click OK on a bunch of stuff. You should be looking for something that says week 2. Go to week 1 stuff in here. Oh, week 2, right. Great. When you find this thing that says week 2, you should click the 3 dots on the corner and hit duplicate. That's going to allow you to make a copy of it into your own. It's like making a copy of the Google Doc, basically. So you'll have a copy and that's what you'll kind of work through for the rest of our session today. All right, could I just get a couple like thumbs up if people got there? Week 2 duplicated. Okay, sweet. All right. Fantastic. So you just duplicated your thing for week 2. You've got your copy of your week 2 project. I'm going to do that as well here so you can see what it looks like. And you may notice, I'm just going to rename this for myself so I remember which copy this is. Rachel name. Okay. This is actually the same template that we started with for last week, but we're going to do Python on it instead of SQL. So just to give you a quick orientation to what you're looking at, this is 2 different cells in our notebook, and these are all the different other types of cells that I can add. Today, primarily, we're going to be adding Python cells. We're going to talk a little bit about magic a little bit later, but we're going to primarily be adding Python cells. You can also add text cells for yourself to kind of type notes as we go. This is a common thing that I do. Anything you add text, you can just sort of jot some like notes. And that's what I've done in this first cell as well. Markdown is just another type of text. What's cool about Hex, one of the things I like about it, is you've got sort of this notebook version where you're working for yourself. If you switch in the top to where it says App Builder, this is where you can choose specific cells from your notebook to present in a final report. So this is really great if you're doing a bunch of data analysis and you want to just present the final to somebody. You can just set some cells to show up in this app view. So in this case, I set my little silly GIF to go in the app view, but not this chunk of code. So it's a little cleaner over there. So it's just a quick orientation to what this screen looks like. I'm going to just hit this little arrow to hide this. Cool. So this is you. So once you have your copy, you can add, try stuff, whatever you want. So I've given you a block of code here to start with. So this is just code I've already provided. This is going to load our data. We're going to talk a little bit more in a couple slides about how this code is working. But for now, all you need to do is hit run, which is this little pink arrow on the upper right of your cell. You can also hit run all at the top. It's not running. It says run all. Yes. So just make sure you hit run, and then this is what we'll be using in a moment. Everybody good so far? Okay, sweet. All right. Cool. All right, so just a couple more kind of things to know to get you oriented to Python. So anything that you write in Python can be sort of like printed out to see what it is, right? So you can imagine if we're going to do a bunch of steps in Python, you can sort of print out whatever you're doing at each intermediate step to see what's going on. Hex will usually preview these results for you, which is great. So you'll sort of see them. If you get stuck at any point, you should try print and then parentheses around whatever you just tried that's not working, and see what it prints out. Okay, so that'll make more sense in a second. Okay, a couple terms to know. We just talked about data frames, right? So data frame is essentially a table. It's a sort of a structure within Python. There's a bunch of other types of structures. I'm not going to talk about those today. Just think of this for now as a data table. All right, a function. Very similar to a function you might remember from math class. This is just a series of steps that you define. You get something for input, maybe multiple things for input, and then something you want to output. All right, and the function is sort of the box in the middle that's doing those steps. The last sort of new term I want to teach for right now is a library. So libraries are great. Libraries are essentially a bunch of functions that somebody else wrote and published for free on the internet for anyone to use. So in many cases, what you're going to be doing is thinking about what you want to do to your data, seeing if a function already exists that you can just reuse. Okay. All right. So we are going to write our first little bits of code. So let's go to your Hex project, and we're going to add a new Python cell. So if you scroll to the bottom, you should see a bar like this and a little sort of like code icon like this that allow you to add a Python cell. Okay, we'll say type Python or add some magic. Here's the first thing I'm going to type in. I'm going to type in the name of one of my data tables. So in green here, these are two data frames. This is some code I'm using to create the data frames. We'll talk about that in a second. But I'm going to type in the name of one of my data frames, in this case, ratings data. And I want to look at a particular column in my ratings data table. Now, how do I know what columns are in here? As you can see, one of these, I'm just reading from an Excel file. So if this were my own project, I would just like open the Excel file and like look at what the column names are called. If I can't remember, if I don't have the original file anymore, whatever, I can do that in Hex. I'm going to go to my browser, which is your third icon in your little left toolbar here. It looks like a little like lightning bolt on a column, sort of. Then you're going to go to data frames, and you're going to see these two tables that we just created. So these two things that are popping up in green here should be in your list. And when you click on them, you're going to see what your columns are. Awesome. All right. So I want to look at the data in one of these columns. So I'm going to do some brackets, and I'm going to say title, and then I'm going to hit run on my cell and see what we spit out. Great. Okay, so this is Hex giving me a little preview of what this data is. Okay, these are titles of Seinfeld episodes. So it's just giving me a list: good news, bad news, the stakeout, the robbery. These sound like sitcom episode names. Great. Okay, so you'll notice that this is a tiny little bit of code, and already it's like printing out something. So that's exactly how we're going to be interacting with Python today, right? Any little bits. We're not writing a big complicated thing to like get our results. Okay. All right. Okay, so we looked at a column. Okay, we can also look at an individual row of our data set. Okay, so I'm going to do that next. To do that, you can type multiple lines of Python in your same cell if you like. The preview will just only show stuff from your most recent line. Okay, so if you want to keep this, you can just do a new Python cell below, which I'm going to do for this purpose. Okay, so in this case, I'm going to type my data frame again. Come back over. All right. So this, we're going to use a little function. We're going to talk about functions again in a second. Function I'm going to use is called iloc, just for location. And then I'm going to give it 0 in brackets. Okay, and then I'm going to hit run. You should always be hitting run. You're like typing a line and hitting run. That's kind of your rhythm. You can also hit Command Enter on your keyboard if you're too lazy to click run, which is what I do. Okay, so this showed us a column, right? We've got 170 episodes. I've got all these titles. This is a row. So you'll notice we've got our 6 columns in our data set. This is going to tell us what values are in those 6 columns for row 0, aka our first row. All right, season 1 is called Good News, Bad News, aired in 1989. Average rating 7.6 from a whole bunch of votes, and there's a little bit of description. Okay, so this is something you would typically want to do when you get a new data set. We talked about this in SQL last week. You do sort of like a select star, see what's in your data. When you get a new data frame, you usually want to do some stuff like this. Just see what's in there, see what you're working with. Okay. All right, everybody able to get some like stuff printing out in the little preview box. Sweet. Okay. All right, so this is the data browser that we just talked about, right? As we create more data frames throughout the session today, you'll see them populate over here. So anytime you want to like remember what it was called or what columns are in it, you can come back to this. It'll update throughout as we add stuff. All right. Okay, now we're going to forget about data frames for a second and just type some stuff into Python so you can kind of see how it works. It's going to be very reactive to whatever you type in. So you can type in stuff much like Excel. You can type in like basic math. I'm going to type in 5 + 5, hit Command Enter, spits out 10, right? Does all the basic kind of stuff. In Excel, I would type in equals 5 + 5, it would spit out 10, right? Same deal. I can also interact with other types of data. I can do cat plus dog. If I'm doing text, I think text needs to be in quotes. And if I run that, I will get hit Nickelodeon show cat dog. Okay. That's a joke. I don't think that shows a hit. Okay. Something else you should know about Python is lists. So we talked about numbers have decimals and stuff, whatever. These are strings, right? Text is called a string in the quotes. If I have a bunch of pieces of information that's not yet a data frame, I might have a list. Okay, so it might be my grocery list. Lists are denoted with brackets. So if I wanted to show you a list, I would do some open square brackets and I would do commas in between my items. Okay, so here's my list of a few items. And then maybe I want to add another list. I want to combine it, let's say gerbil. And then it's going to show me my result. It's combined my 2 separate lists. So I had a list with 2 items, list with 1 item. It's combined into a list with 3 items. Okay, so it's pretty logical. It's going to like kind of do whatever you want as far as like basic functions. Okay. All right, so this is numbers, strings, and lists. Okay, these are some of your like most common basic data types you're going to run into. We can do this same sort of thing with columns in our data set. Okay, this is where this starts to get powerful. So our data frame, for example, I'm going to notice that it's got a couple different numeric columns. It's got a rating and it's got a season number. This doesn't like conceptually make sense, but just to demonstrate, I can add columns together. So I'm going to say ratings data, and I'm going to add together the season number and the rating number. Okay, there's probably like no reason I would do this in real life. Just an example to show you what this can do. I'm gonna hit run, and it's gonna show me the season number added to whatever the rating number for that episode was. So if I check my first one, it was season 1, it was rated 7.6. So this is gonna spit out 8.6 because it's adding those values together. Okay. So it's doing that all the way down the column just from this one line. This is where it starts to get powerful with using a data frame. You can imagine if you have thousands and thousands of rows, you could just type something like this and just get your other column added. Okay. So similar to what you could do in Excel or SQL. All right. So you're already writing some basic Python. This is cool. So this is what we just talked about. There's a few different types of data. This is one of those things where there's a whole rabbit hole of like more complicated types of data that I'm going to skip over. For the purposes of getting started, strings, numbers, lists, and data frames are all that you want to know. Okay, so we just did a few little kind of little tiny scripts, you might call them, right? We did a little thing and it spit out a little result. Right now, we have no way to refer back to these results. Okay, so I've got my list of 3 different pets, or I've got this column that's not saved anywhere. So if I want to like display that or query it with SQL or do something else down the line, I can't get to it. So we're going to use a programming concept called variables. This is essentially just saving a result to refer to later. Okay. You can think of a variable as like a sticky note. Okay, you can have as many as you want. You can name them whatever you want. And whenever you refer to it by name, it's going to give you what you stored in there. Okay, so for example, I could take 2 lists that I'm combining, some of my favorite snacks, and I can give it a name. Okay, it's got to be no spaces in the name, so it's common to use underscores, equals, and then that's going to save my results to this little variable, this little like post-it note called favorite snacks. Okay, so let me show you how that works. So if I go back to our pets here, for example, I'm going to add pets equals this little list. I'm going to hit run. Okay, and you'll see that my preview went away, but I got a little pop-up to tell me that there's a little variable called pets. So I know that there's like something stored in there. So maybe I'm writing some other code and I want to go back to my variable that I stored. Okay, what were those pets? I can just type in pets here in a new Python cell, hit run, spits out my results. Pretty nifty. Okay, so this is where I store stuff as I'm going. Same deal with columns for your data set. So here's where I added my 2 columns together. I got the sort of nonsense number. I can add a new column to my data set. So I'm going to get my data set. I'm going to look at my 6 column names. And I'm going to make up a new column name. I'm going to call this a new column, but you could definitely call it something more creative if you like. Okay, I'm going to put it in brackets, just like my existing column names, put my equal sign in there, and I'm going to hit run. Okay, now you'll notice my little preview disappears, but in my little thing, suddenly instead of 6 columns in my little data browser on the left, I have 7. I have one called new column. And if I come back here and refer to it like I did before, my data set, new column, run that, it's going to spit out my results. Yeah. Yep. So I just went back up to this one where we had our example of our season number plus our rating number. I just added this part in front of it here. Okay, so it was again our name of our data frame, brackets, parentheses, and brackets, quotes, and then a new column name, a column name that doesn't exist in here yet. You can call it whatever you want. You can run that, and you should see it pop up in your data browser for your ratings data table. You'll see it pop up in there. All right. Okay. All right. So this is what we just talked about. You've got a new column. You can save to it whatever other column manipulation you've done. You can always look in your data browser to see what you got. Okay. All right. So variables allow you to store the results of a calculation, right? We added our 2 lists together. So we had a list of 3 items. We saved that to pets. Okay, so that's saved there. Now, what if this concept of combining lists, what if I want to be able to do that to some other lists in the future? Okay, I want to be able to go back to like the steps that I took and not just the result that I got. Okay, that's where we're going to use a function. So we've been using some predefined functions. For example, just plus is like a computer predefined function that we're already using. We can use more complicated predefined functions, and we can also define our own functions. Okay, and this is where it gets interesting. Okay. So here's an example of writing your own function. Most of you guys have said you never have seen Python before. That's okay. I'm going to walk through this and just sort of how to read this at like a intro level. Okay. So whenever you see something with def, that means you're defining a function. Okay. your function is going to have a name like this. I'm calling this one my function. It's going to have some parentheses, and then it's going to have 0 to infinity of things that you can give it as inputs. Okay, in this case, I'm going to give it 2 inputs. The 2 inputs I'm going to give it are a list and then a string. Okay, so remember my list was my thing in brackets and my string is a thing in quotes. And then I'm going to think about what I want to output. And what I want to output for this little sample function is I want to take everything on my list and add my little string onto the end of each item. Okay, that's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to define some sort of variable here that I'm going to return at the end. Return is my output. Okay, so I've got a couple of things I'm putting in, typically like one thing I'm spitting back out. Okay. Then I've got this funky thing here, for item in input 1. Okay, this is a programming concept called a for loop, but you don't really need to know that to look at this because Python is written in like pretty clear, like English language. Okay, so for item in input 1, it's going to do something with this item. Okay, so it's taking an item from input 1. I know that's a list. So I'm like, okay, it's grabbing a thing from my list. It's adding on input 2, which I know is a string. Okay, so it's sticking another string on the end of my thing. And then it's saving it to this new thing, new variable, new post-it note. Okay. All right, then it's taking my little variable from up here, the thing I want to output, which is not a great variable name, it's kind of long. Dot append, I don't know what dot is, we haven't really talked about that yet. New item. Okay. So the thing I want to output, append new item. Just in English, what does that mean? You're sticking your thing on the end of your list, right? You had a list, you add a new item to the end. For item in input, it's a list. For is a concept where it's going to loop through every item in our list. And then it's going to return the thing that you want to output. Okay, so without knowing a ton about programming or really Python at all, get a like rough sense of what this is doing, right? It's not completely mysterious. Yeah. Okay. So here's an example of using that function. So once I've written that function, which is this, I only have to write this once. Here's how I'm going to use it. I'm going to say its name and then give it 2 pieces of input and see what it actually does. Okay, now from what I just talked about, what's going to happen when I run this function? It's going to go through my list. It's going to take the first item in the list. It's going to add this string on the end. I'm going to take the next item on the list, add this string on the end. Take this item, add this string on the end, stick those all in another variable and return that variable. Okay, so let's go see what that looks like. I've got that one saved already, so I don't have to type it. Yeah, here we go. Great. So this is my function definition here. That's the same one we just looked at. This is me running my function, A cats, B cats, C cats. Okay. So this is obviously like a silly function. You probably wouldn't necessarily need to do this, but you could imagine maybe I want to take the average. Maybe I want to add in my other data source. I need to combine these columns, stuff like that. This is exactly the kind of thing that you can do with functions. Basic idea of functions makes sense? Okay. All right. Okay, now to connect this idea to data frames, we can also use functions on a column of our data frame. Okay, so this is again similar to like Excel. If you're going to apply a little formula and then copy paste it all the way down, it'll apply to all your rows. Same deal here. Okay, so if I take my function and I give it a column of my data set instead of just a list I typed out, and then my string, it's going to attach that string to everything in that column. And this is actually the same in this case as just adding this string on to my data set. So just so you can see what that looks like. Let's see. Do this over here, do my new cell, and we'll do ratings. We'll do title. We'll do plus. Sort of silly string. Okay, and then I got my same list of episode titles I did before, but with this string attached all the way down. Okay, this is the type of manipulation I can do. Okay. All right, so I've done this. I've added cats to the end of every title. I'm making a Seinfeld spinoff where everyone is a cat. All right, how would I save this information to my data frame? Same thing that we just talked about. I would just make a new column and set it equal to this thing that I typed out here. So maybe I will call this column, I'm gonna go to the beginning here. And I'm gonna type in the name of my data frame, ratings data, come up with a new column name. I'm gonna call it title with no, it's usually good to do no spaces here. So I'm gonna do underscores, I'm gonna call it title with cats equals this thing, spit this out. And then I'm gonna notice my data browser, I have 8 columns now, and one of them is called title with cat. So I've saved this result to my data frame. Okay. All right. Okay, now let's get into, this is sort of how we structured what we talked about last week, and this is normally how you'll be using Python in real life. Okay, typically you'll have a question and you'll be trying to answer that question. Maybe you've tried to answer it in Excel and it's like very tedious, so you can't quite figure out how to do it, or it's just a huge data set and Excel keeps crashing. These are the types of times you might want to turn to this tool. Here's a question we might want to investigate. What are the most commonly used words in Seinfeld episode titles? Okay. Now you could notice with this question that we might have other similar questions. Okay, most commonly used words in episode descriptions, most commonly used words in the script of the episode themselves. Okay, this is a question where we might have other similar questions. This might be a good use case for a function. If we write a function, we could use it on the titles, but we could also use it on the descriptions. We could use it on something else later, a show that's not Seinfeld. We could use it on data set about podcasts. That's the idea with functions, is sort of a repeatable thing. All right, but typically you don't start with writing a function, you start with writing just kind of a very simple script. So when you're thinking about getting started with code, and this is similar to Excel as well, you're essentially just doing some structured thinking, okay? So this is sort of the approach you should take with each kind of bit of code that you write. This also would apply to an Excel formula or anything else, okay? So what is your question? What is your desired output? Are you trying to get to a single number? Are you trying to get to a table? Or you're like, what are you trying to get to? What is your input? So what data sources do you have available? What work have you already done? And then from there, what's kind of like the first step or the first piece of info that you need to get closer to your output, right? How do you take your input and get one step closer to your output? And specifically with Python, you can ask this great question. Is there already an existing function that somebody else wrote that can help get me to my desired output? Can I like reuse work either that I did or somebody else did in the past to get me to my desired output? Okay, so to make this a little bit more concrete, let's talk about our specific question. What are the most commonly used words in Seinfeld episode titles? Okay, so what is our desired output? We're gonna get really specific. We want a list of words in order of most common to least common. Okay, so I know I don't want one thing, I don't want a whole data frame, I just want my list of words. Okay. What is my input? What data sources do I have? Well, hop over to here, look over at my data sources. I've got a data frame that's got a row for every episode with its title. Okay, so that's what I'm starting from. So what's the first piece of info I need to answer this question? Specifically the titles from my data frame, right? That's specifically where I got to start. Is there an existing function I can use to get me to my desired output? This is where, as a beginner data analyst, I would highly recommend that you Google. Is there a function that I can use? And what I'm hoping that you'll get out of this sort of session is how to identify what function you might want to use, how to plug it into your situation, okay? All right, so let's go through this step by step. How am I going to answer this question? First thing I need to do is grab my title column. We already did this earlier, right? We just go to our data frame, we grab our title. I know I'm going to need that piece of information. So I'm going to type that into a Python cell, maybe run it and just make sure it spits back what I want. Okay, great. Next thing I want to do is Google for a function. Did I leave my Google tab up? Yes, I did. Okay, so I Googled, how do I find the most common word in a list? Python. Okay, this is like a very nobody who like writes code has all the things memorized. You're doing a lot of like Google and find. Okay, I found this post. All right, this looks like kind of similar to what I'm trying to do, right? They got like a list of words. They want to know what they are. Here's some code that somebody else wrote that does this. Now, here's how I know somebody else wrote it. Collections, so this thing that says from collections import counter. This is a library. So this is a library, and this is a function that somebody else has written that does this for me. So once you've done your kind of structured thinking right here of like, what exactly do I want? You have something more specific that you can search for and see if it exists out there in the world. Okay, as you do this a little bit, you'll get a sense of like what kind of things already exist versus what kinds of things you might need to write yourself. Okay. All right. So we'll talk more about libraries in a second, but I'm like, all right, I know roughly what I need. I'm going to Google it. I found a library, a function that's going to do what I want. I found this one called counter. I'm going to copy paste this little bit from this post that I found, but I'm going to sub in my first piece of info. Okay, so my little post that I found, right? They had like list one, which is some like nonsense data. I don't care about list one. I just care about my ratings data thing. So I just plugged that in. Okay. All right. So this is this bit. Let me show you what it looks like when we run that. So as soon as I find a little bit of code that I think might help me, I'm going to run it. Okay, I always want to run it so I see what I'm working with. Okay. Now this looks pretty interesting. This is each episode title and then how many times it appears. So it looks like this is just the title of every episode and then one, because no episode titles are repeated. So this is like kind of close to what I want, but what's the problem? How do I get from this to the most common word appearing in episode titles? Got to split apart the title, right? It's treating each title as like a whole unit. So it's saying this title, good news, bad news, appears once, not news appears twice, good appears once, bad appears once, right? I'm trying to pull out the words. This is pulling out just titles. Okay. So I got to figure out how to get the words out of here. Okay. So I'm getting started though. I'm starting to get closer to what I want. This is how the process goes. You write little bits and you think about, okay, how do I get from where I have closer to where I want to be with my output? Okay. All right. So just a quick aside on libraries. Okay, when you look for existing functions and you see something like import or from blank import, that's a library. When that import line, you only need to do this once, and then you can use counter 1,000 more times in your code. You just need to put this line once at the beginning before you use it. All right, there's a bunch of libraries, and the one that we use to import our data at the beginning actually is a very common data science, data analysis library called pandas. This one is used so commonly that it has a very common little nickname, PD, so you don't have to type pandas every time. So I've imported this at the beginning, as PD is just a convention. That's a little nickname for the library pandas. And it's got a few functions associated with it that I'm using so that I don't have to write the code from scratch of look at the CSV file, read the first row, save it to a data frame, repeat for each row. I'm not going to rewrite that because that would be a bad use of my time, right? Somebody else has already done that much smarter and better than me. Great, I'm going to use it. Okay. That's libraries. All right. Objects. Okay, so sometimes when you're looking at functions, you're going to see that they happen like this. They're going to have a dot and then your function name versus the example I showed you before where I just started with my function name, right? My function, parentheses, some stuff. Okay, you don't need to know a ton about this. I'm going to kind of glaze over this, but all you need to know is that some functions, you can just call them by themselves, and some of them are called methods. They're going to be a dot and then their name. Okay, so you're going to see both. They work the same, but typically these are going to be if you have some sort of object like a data frame, a function that works specifically on that object is going to be dot, that function, versus something that you could give any sort of object to. Okay, so our little thing right here, right? Pandas is sort of like a abstract object that it's giving us. And that object can do things like read a CSV. So that's why this is a dot here for our CSV. Okay. All right. You don't need to worry a ton about this. Just know that functions can exist with the dot and without. Okay, just so you know. All right, if you have any doubt about the type of a piece of code, kind of where am I? Is this a data frame? Is it a string? Is it a variable? What's going on? You can wrap it around and type just to see what it is. Okay, so for example, I'm going to do type. And I'm going to do my ratings data. We'll run that. And it's going to tell me that it's a pandas data frame. Great. So you can always check if you don't know what something is or you're getting an error. What type is it? It's a good thing that you can check. Okay. All right. So let's go back to our question. Our question is, what is the most common word most commonly found in episode titles? Okay. So this is the little bit that I did before. All right. This is where I got each title and then the count of 1. But what I really want is each individual word to count across all these titles, right? I want to count by word. Okay. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm like, okay, I need words. So I'm going to create a place to store the words. Okay. I'm going to do that by creating a new variable. I'm going to call it something like words, all words. And I'm going to create an empty list. Okay, brackets without anything inside is just an empty list. I can add stuff to it later. Okay. I'm going to use this concept we saw before called a for loop. Okay, for title in my column of titles. Do a colon here for these. For each word in my title, okay, I'm going to use a function called split. You can use this on strings. This is something you can Google, right? Strings split the words. Something I may Google to find this. Okay, title.split is going to split the words. So just to show you what that looks like. Let's say, all right, let's do my title example. Let's split this. Okay, so dot split is just going to split it into a list of its words. Okay, that's all dot split is doing. And then it's going to go all words, my empty list, append word. Okay, so what's that doing? It's going to this list, sticking each word in there, and then it's repeating that for every single title that in all my episodes. Okay, so if I take my little thing here, that's what dot split does. Okay, I'm gonna split out this little part. Okay, so all I'm doing here is just trying to get to a list of words, because up here we were working with a list of episodes and it's not counting what I want it to count, right? It's counting at the wrong level. So this is what I've done here. And then I'm going to print. This is what I was saying at the beginning, where you want to print if you want to see if it worked. So I wrote this and like, did this work? Did this get me all my words? I'm going to do print all my words and see, good news, bad news. Okay, so it's splitting out each word, the stakeout. Okay, I've got my list of words. This is looking more promising for me. Makes sense? Makes sense how this is one step closer to our result than this was? Yeah. You don't need to skip a line. I just do it sometimes for my own organization. The skipping line is totally up to you. All right. So now I've got this part, right? So we talked about this part, we talked about this part. So now that I've got my list of just words instead of my list of episode titles, I'm going to essentially try again this part that I did. So I found this function. I thought it might be handy. I gave it my ratings data, just title column. And I tried to use the function and it didn't really give me what I want. So I'm going to try this again, but instead of my title, I'm going to give it my new list of words, the list of words that I just made where it was a good news, that right, where it's separated out. Essentially going to copy this, come down to a new cell down here, but I'm going to swap this part out because it seems like this didn't get me quite what I wanted. So I'm going to delete this guy. And instead I'm going to put in my variable all words. Okay. When I run that, okay, this looks a lot closer to what I wanted, right? This is saying the word the appeared 169 times in all the episode titles. The word Jerry appeared in 3. That makes sense. He's the main character. The word good appeared in 2, and on and on. Okay, so this is what I wanted as opposed to this, which is just counting each full title. Okay, that conceptually make sense what we did there? Okay, so we knew that we needed something about words from our titles. So we found a function that could count how often words appear. We tried it on our titles. We realized that our titles weren't split apart into words. So then we did a little messing around trying to figure out how to split our title into words. And then we tried our function again with that split into words, and that got us what we wanted. Okay. All right. All right. So let's take a quick breather there. So that kind of walking through what we did just now, you're not going to be able to do that on your own quite yet. That's okay. I want to start to show you sort of the flow of how it works, how you go through each step. Okay. I should have put code here instead of query. Okay. So just to get you guys writing some more Python. So I want to give you a chance to try out a couple of the smaller things that we just talked about. So go ahead and find the type of any of the things that we've looked at before. One of the variables that you made, our data frame, one of our columns. Go ahead and find the type, which is our function type parentheses. Okay, so do a new Python cell, do type, put something in the parentheses, and hit run. See what you get back. Okay. So I could do something like this. Type. I could just put a number in there if I want. It's an integer. Great. Try some other stuff. Put some other stuff in this parentheses, hit run, and see what it gives back. Okay. Name of your data frame, name of a column. Give that a whirl. All right. Once you played around with that a little bit, just to see some of the different results that you get, now I want you to add a new column to your ratings data frame. Okay, you can make up any name for your column that you want. You should add a new column that multiplies the rating by 10. Okay. So this is very similar to what we did before. So you want to grab the column that has this piece of information in your data frame, right? It's just going to be called rating. You can check the name in the data browser. See if it's capitalized or anything. Okay. Multiply it by 10 and then save that. So I would recommend starting with this part. See if you can get that to work. We did one where we added some columns together, right? So it's going to be very similar. So multiply by 10 and then try to save it to a new column in your data frame. Okay. Let me give you a second. I'll try that. All right. Anybody got a new column added? Give me a little thumbs up when you get one. All right, who's got a column? Anybody? Yeah? What you got? All right, so I'm gonna say, and you made a column by doing the name of our data frame. We did some brackets. Okay. Great. Fantastic. Let's run that and see what that does. Great. Okay, it didn't spit out an error. That's good. And I see my little data browser thing right here. I've got my new column. Very promising. I'm gonna go look at my new column. I'm gonna do ratings data with expand rating. All right, let's run that. Boom. Okay, before I know this was 7.6. Remember that from earlier? Now it's 76. Awesome. Did it all the way down my column. Fabulous. Okay, perfect. Very, very good. Okay. So again, this is just basic math, right? But the idea is you can do this with any level of complexity of function. We can do more complicated math, more complicated text stuff, etc. Okay. It's sort of just the foundation of understanding how to get stuff to apply to your data frame. Okay, so you should have something very similar to that. Okay, so we talked a little bit about functions before, which is kind of how to reuse the set of steps that you did instead of just the results that you got the one time you did it. Okay, so function is reusing your set of steps. So this is that same chunk of code I wrote before, right? Where I found the function, I split up my words, and then I used my function on my little split up words. Okay. So if I were like, okay, great, well, I want to do this on title and I want to do it on description and I want to do it on this other data set that I have and I want to combine a bunch of stuff together, what I would do is I would rewrite this into a function. Okay. So this should look a little bit familiar when we talked about functions before. It's going to have def, which tells me that I'm just defining my function for the first time. And this is how I would translate all of this into a function. Okay, so I would give it a name. I'm going to call it something like find most common word. And the only input I'm giving it is just this column from my data set, right? That's the only input I'm giving it. So I'm just going to give it one input in my parentheses. I might name it something handy like column, so I know what I'm referring back to later when I can find this code. I'm basically going to copy this. I'm going to say all my words, great. And then I've got the space where I referred to my specific column. I'm just going to use my new little kind of placeholder variable column. So this line is basically the same. I'm just swapping in my new little input. So it could be any general input that I put into this function. This is exactly the same, these two lines. Okay, or I guess I use thing instead of title, same deal, doesn't matter. This is just sort of like a variable, so it's a post-it note, I can call it whatever I want. And then I'm going to have it return to this last line of code that I ran here. This is what it's going to return. So return is like spit out. This is what it's going to spit out at the end. So I wrote this little chunk of code. I kind of like figured it out as I went, did it for my one little thing. That's a very common way you're going to be using Python in data analysis. When you get to a place where you're like, oh, I want to like copy paste this code and just change a few things, that's usually a good time to just write a function instead. That's going to be a little easier, less copy pasting, less chance for errors, that kind of thing. Right. Also, that way, if you decide you want to change how your function works, you could just change it here. And then everywhere that you use that function, that change will follow. Make sense? Cool. Okay. All right. Quick aside on AI. All right. So when you logged into Hex, you might have noticed the magic function. We talked about this a little bit last week with SQL. So when you're creating a cell, your first option is magic. All right. Magic is Hex's name for their little AI assist tool. All right. Other AI tools offer similar stuff. And basically it can write some SQL for you. It can write some Python for you. It can create a basic visualization for you using some of the Hex stuff. I recommend that you try this out. Okay, the way that I would recommend using this, the way that I use it, it's kind of as a first draft. It doesn't really, for data stuff, it doesn't really get it right on the first try. It can give you an outline. It can give you like the right function to use, for example, but it might not grab the right column name. It might get some things wrong. Okay, so you all are learning Python when these tools already exist. So there's no point in me standing here trying to teach you like you should memorize all of like these things about Python, because that's not how the world works anymore. You can look up stuff like, you can use one of these assistants, whatever. This is sort of like a on steroids version of what programmers have been doing for years, which is what I just showed you, right? Look up on a forum, copy paste your part, like put it together. This is like that on steroids, right? So my goal for this is to teach you how to understand enough about how specifically today, Python works so that you can do this, right? You could run a like AI command, see what you get, understand enough about how it works to be able to tweak it into what you need. Make sense? So we're going to walk through a couple examples of that. We did this last week with SQL. We'll talk about it's a little different with Python, or a little more involved with Python. So I want to show you how that works. Okay, so I'm going to give the AI the thing that we just did without AI. Okay, I'm going to give it a prompt, and I'm not going to get into the whole, like, there's a whole thing about how to write good prompts for AI. I'm not going to go into that rabbit hole right now. I wrote was probably not a great prompt for AI. Write a Python function to find the most common word in a data frame column. Okay, I was trying to get it to do what we just did. All right, Magic wrote this function. Okay, this is the exact code that it spit it out, or that it spat out for me. Okay, so just looking at what it spit out, def, okay, it's defined a function. Looks like it's taking two inputs, df, which is an abbreviation for data frame, and a column. All right, let's try to understand what it's doing. So words, that's the name of a variable. Data frame column, okay, it's like ratings title or ratings data title. Okay, dot stir, I don't know what that is. Dot split, okay, we saw that before, that was splitting up words. Dot explode, I don't know what that is. Okay, that's doing something. All right, word counts, it's calling that same function that I found by Googling, calling counter with the words. So it's doing some kind of function called counter. Then it's got a new variable, most common word, which is doing word counts, this thing, another function called most common, some other numbers on the end, and then it's returning the value of that variable. Okay, so from a quick read, without knowing what some of these functions do, it's like generally seems like it's answering our prompt, right? It like seems like it's in the right direction. Okay, great. So first thing that you should do is test this function. Okay, so I'm going to grab the function, and it said it wanted a data frame and a column name. So I'm going to do that. Okay, I'm going to run this function, and this is what I get. I did the description data, which we didn't really look at a ton yet. Let's see if I still have this up. Yeah, great. Okay, so the function that I just wrote, right, that I just showed you on the previous screen before we did the AI, the function that I wrote when I run it on the descriptions shows this. The most common word in the episode descriptions is a instead of the, and then to instead of Jerry or whatever else, right? So this is how this data looks. Okay, when I run my AI thing, the function that AI wrote, I get a single word, a. Okay, now technically that answered my question. The question that I prompted it with was the most common word, and it gave me the most common word. All right, so it's got the same result that I did manually. I have, in this case, I've like doing it as in this order, but that makes sense. Otherwise, I might just like read through some of the descriptions and be like, oh, this makes sense for a common word, kind of gut check, right? It literally only gives us the first word though, right? When I wanted the prompt, I really wanted something more like an ordered list, which I didn't ask it for super specifically enough. It just gave me one word. I really want like mentally the top 10 for whatever I'm going to be doing. And it also named this function the same as my function that I wrote. So it's kind of like a funny thing. So now when I call this function, it calls the one that the AI wrote instead of the one that I wrote. Okay. So it might give the function a funky name, something like that. So in this case, I scroll past my little preview thingy here. I renamed it. So this is the one that it wrote. I just changed the name to be AI so I could tell which one the AI wrote and which one I wrote. Okay, so things like changing the name, changing the column, like there are little things like that that you might want to change in your AI sort of results. Okay. All right. So what I would do if I were you, and so if I were you, right, I wouldn't have written this myself first. I would have just tried it with the magic, right? Because you guys don't know a ton about writing your own functions. So here's what you want to do. When you're reading through the code it gives you back, you want to do a quick Google of like what each of these things are so you understand what they do, and then kind of go through it line by line. You can actually run each individual part of this and just see what it spits out to understand what it's doing. Okay, so I saw in the code that it spit out, right? This is what it gave me. Which tab am I on? This guy. Okay. So this is what it gave me, right? df column dot stir dot split dot explode. What the heck is that doing? Okay, so what I would probably do is take this out, get rid of all these functions and just do the first one. Okay, so I'm just gonna cut that out. I'm just gonna run this and see what this does. Okay. Ooh, okay, not an error, but some funky thing about how it's a string. Okay, I don't really know what that does, so we'll just move on. Okay, this is what I recommend you do. Okay, let's go to the next one. So I'm going to take off explode and just look at split. What does split do? Okay, let's look at that. All right. So this looks like, so it's separating out each word. That makes sense. We saw that before, and it's still got like a row for each episode. Okay, so that like makes sense. It's splitting out the words. I know I need to do that for this to work. Great. Let's see what explode does. It doesn't blow up my computer. Let's find out. Okay, cool. So this is taking each word and putting it sort of within its own row in the output, right? What we had before, we added explode. Was each row had a list of words, right? I see list, I see my brackets. Adding explode is like splitting each word into its own row. Cool. Okay, that kind of makes sense to me. When I wrote this code for you guys, I did my like for, and I looped through each word in each title, right? And added it to a list. This is doing it a little differently, but it's like, it's putting all the words in a list, right? Same concept. Okay, that makes sense. All right. So good. All right. So it spit out this code. I don't really know what this code does, but I've like run little bits of it so I can like kind of understand what it's doing. This is what you should do when you have AI generate code for you. Okay. All right. Let's get into another example. All right. This is going to be a little bit more of a complicated example. So I'm going to use my function that I wrote. I could use the one that AI wrote to grab the most common words in the descriptions of the episodes. All right, so I'm grabbing my descriptions. This is this thing I've got here. It's my most common. All right. Oh, I think I've got it on this guy. Okay. Cool. All right, so description words, so I've just called my function that I wrote or the one that AI wrote, and then description words is my variable. Okay, great. So I'm going to write another prompt, and I'm going to say, use Python to create a word cloud of all these description words. We know what a word cloud is. It's like a visual. More time a word appears, the bigger it is in the visual. Let's see if Python can do that. So it generated this chunk of code. What do we see at the top here? Some import. Anyone remember what we're importing? Or you might check out books from. It's killing me. Library. Okay. So it's got some libraries at the top, right? So I'm like, okay, cool. It sounds like there's a library called word cloud. Seems like that might do what I want. Nice. Library called matplotlib. Plot. I don't really know what that is. Plot sounds like a visual. Okay. It added a little comment here. This is kind of nifty. Anytime you have a pound sign in Python, that line's not going to do anything. It's just a note to yourself. It's good to write notes to yourself if you're writing longer bits of code. All right, it's doing word cloud equals. So it's set some sort of like variable for me called word cloud. It's doing a function called word cloud that it's giving a bunch of information, including my description words. Okay, cool. This sounds promising. And then it says it's going to plot the word cloud image. Amazing. Got a bunch of this like plot dot functions, an axis, a figure, a layout. I don't know exactly what that is, but it sounds like it's going to make a visual. Awesome. Plot dot show. Okay, cool. And then it gives me an error message. This is a very common output for, at least in my experience, from when you like prompt the AI to like write something like this for you. It like looks pretty right, and then you get an error. Okay, so this is commonly what you'll see. All right, so let's talk about this. So whenever you get this, you should look at what the error message says. Python, as far as programming languages go, has like a more useful error messages than it might originally appear. Type error, we don't know what that is. Trace back, we don't know what that is. This looks like computer speak. This, okay, this looks familiar. This is a copy of 3 lines of the code from right here. Right, it's copying a little segment of the code. And then it's got a sentence at the bottom. It says, sequence item 0, expected str instance tuple found. Okay, str, expected str. Str, we saw that before, was string. Right, so it's saying I expected a string and I got something that wasn't a string. Okay, that's starting to make sense to me because I know that description words, the thing that I gave it, If I go back to my little thing here, description words, if I print it out, let's do a Python cell, which I'm just going to add in between here. If I remember what my function did, it's giving it like a list. The parentheses thing is another structure called a tuple, similar to a list. You don't really need to know that, but I can tell from this that this is not, these are not strings. These are a list of these like lists basically, right? So my error message is that it expected a string. I can see that this isn't a string. I see why it errored, right? I see why it errored. Okay. So that's the first thing you got to do when you get an error is figure out for yourself what it's complaining about. Okay. All right. So once you know what it's complaining about, you have a path to fix it. So it wants strings. I'm not giving it strings. How could I give it strings? Okay. And this sounds kind of familiar. We did this earlier. This is a chunk of code you already saw earlier from the titles. We had the whole title and we just wanted to split it into the words. This is the same little bit of code. Okay. So I already wrote code that did this. So I could just do this for descriptions instead of title. There's my list of strings. Let's try swapping that in. It's probably going to be happier with that. Okay. So I changed here where previously this said description words. I made a new variable called all words, and I ran this chunk of code, but for descriptions. Okay, I swapped that in, ran my code, and I printed out this thing. Extremely cool. That's awesome. This, did not take me a ton of time. Doing this manually would have taken, oh my God, Canva, I don't even want to think about it. Okay, super cool. All right, so we got to a very cool result. We started with a prompt, kind of an ambitious prompt, see if this can happen. Got an error message. Okay, but we didn't get frustrated. We looked at what it said, thought about why it was having an error, thought about a solution. Maybe we already saw, maybe you're repeating steps here where you might go sort of Google a function that might help you. We swapped one thing. You always want to change like one thing and try it, one thing and try it one step at a time. So we swapped our one thing. We got lucky, that worked. Okay. All right. So these are examples with using this AI assistant. So key points of using any of these AI assistants, whether you use the one built into Hex or any other ChatGPT, any of these tools. Every time it gives you code, you want to read the code and step through in your own brain what it's doing. All right. These things don't have like actual logic built in them. They're spitting out something that it thinks looks like code. It can have really like weird errors that a human would never write, right? It can call a data source that doesn't exist, or it can make up a column name that doesn't exist in your data, right? Just errors that you would never make as a human, but that it would make because it's like sort of acting more of a parrot situation, right? So you want to be able to go through and step through in your brain. Okay, this says something about a string. Okay, this says something about like split. What's explode? I don't know. Let me copy paste that part out and run it so that I see what that's doing. Okay, you want to step through. If you got an error message, which is pretty common, especially the first time it spits something out, read the error message. A surprising number of people get to this stage and they're like, oh, didn't work. I give up. Can't use Python for this. We'll use like something else. Take a moment and read your error message. You can also copy paste the whole text of, like, I would copy paste this sentence into Google and see how other people have solved this error message. Something else you can do. My experience is that the AI assistants, like when you get here, it'll pop up with like want AI to help you debug. That like has only ever made it worse in my experience. Maybe it'll get better in the next few years, but it's not very good at going from here and figuring out like what it did wrong, because at this point it's sort of between what it did and what's in your brain. Okay, so it's not like it can't really help itself at this point. Okay, so once you get an error message, you should read the error message and then try changing one little bit at a time or running one little line at a time until you figure out what's going on. Okay, does that make sense as far as using this? So, I mean, for today's session, for the sessions this week, feel free to use Magic, right? As we're like, let's switch the little activity and like try it out. Like, go ahead and try giving it a prompt, right? See what it spits out, and try this process, right? This is sort of how you'll be writing code. And then as you are using this, you can decide what's faster. For me, a lot of things I write, I learned coding before this existed. So I'm faster at just writing it because that's what I know how to do. when I'm using like an unfamiliar function, or if maybe I haven't used Python in a couple of weeks, feeling a little rusty, yeah, I'll use magic and I'll go through this process that I just walked through with you. I'll get something that looks kind of right. I'll like Google some stuff, muck around with it a little bit, probably get where I'm going faster than if I didn't use it. Yeah? Make sense? Question?
Can you explain the difference between object and function, like when you're talking about
Yeah, exactly. So function you can think of as like a set of steps, like a set of instructions. So a function is going to be like take out two pieces of bread, put jelly on one, put peanut butter on the other, put them back together, go. And then your input to that function could be sourdough, white, wheat, pumpernickel. You know what I mean? You can input whatever, and it's going to do the same set of steps. An object is like a thing. So it's gonna the most common object we talked about today is a data frame. So a data table. So your data table is going to have, like our ratings data table has 171 rows. It has specific values in there. It's not like, it has no instructions. It just like exists as a thing. I can edit the thing, I can delete the thing, I can add to the thing, but it like exists. So it's sort of like instructions versus like information storage. Does that make sense? Cool. Good question. All right. Okay, so let's try a couple more things. So like I said, you can try these like we were writing them at the beginning of class, just try it writing them yourself. You can try doing a magic prompt and seeing what it gives back. You can try both, okay? I want you to try adding a couple more columns to your data frame where you apply a function. Okay, we already did, hopefully everybody had time to do the one where we did the season number by 10. Okay, try some other stuff. Either try some of these or think of one that you want to try. Okay, add your dog's name to the end of every episode title. Try to count the words in each title. Right, think of something like that. Some function, you can use these, you can think of your own, but I want you to add 2 columns to your ratings data frame where you're applying some sort of function to all your rows in your data frame. Okay. Once you do that, I want you to try turning it into a function. So this is what we did before, where I wrote a little code where I added, let's see if I can scroll back to this piece. Okay, cool, great. So in this one, right, originally I just wrote this part of the code, so I didn't have this part. I was just adding 2 of my columns together, and then I'm saving it into my column, okay? So that's what you're gonna be doing. And then do I have an example of this? Okay. I had my one where I wrote my function that adds cats to the end of everything, and I applied that to my column. Go back up. It's above this. Yeah, because then here I have. Yeah, okay. Here's where I added my title with cats, right? That was applying my function that I wrote to that column so that it's added here. So I could have rewritten this. So example, comment this out and do a function. And I'm going to give it ratings data title. We don't know. Maybe I did it further down here. Okay. So if I run this, it gives my same, probably I'll fix that typo in a second. So if I run this, right, it gives me the same result as this. This is me applying a function to my data frame. So what I want you to try a couple of these or something else, add some new columns, manipulate your data a little bit, and then try writing out a function. Okay, like I said, you can use the magic prompt thing if you want to, see what it spits out, and try kind of stepping through it and making sure you understand what it's doing. Okay. I'm gonna give you all a couple minutes to do that. Wave at me if you are stuck or get an error message, and it will come help. All right, anybody get a new column on their data frame? Okay, anybody got a column? Did anyone do the dog's name one? Does anyone have a dog? No. All right, what columns did we add? This half the room, anybody? Column that you added to your data frame? Or did you run into an error? Okay,
Good
okay. Cool,
ratings.
great. Ratings data. All right, great. Expand season, okay. Great. So, sweet. All right. What are you worried about? Isn't right about this?
Oh, I don't know. Sure.
All right.
I was playing with
Okay. Cool. Well, first thing, let's check if this is correct. Best way to check is to just print stuff out. Okay, so what I'm going to do is just grab this column name now that we have it. Just type that in, right? So just our data frame on our column and run it and see what we have, see what it looks like. And when I do that, I get 10, 10, 10, 10, 10, and then way down at the bottom, 90, 90, 90, 90, 90. I know it had 9 seasons, so sweet, great. You can always check for yourself if it works, which is always a great thing to do. Cool. Okay, you're trying to add the dog's name thing. Weren't sure how to get that going, yeah? All right, sweet. Let's talk. Did anybody do that? Anybody like add a string to your column? Nope. Okay, cool. Let's talk about that one. So let's say I want to add to the title. Which column are you trying to add it to?
that's-
Episode number. Okay, great. So let's try that. What's that column? Oh, were you in the other data set? Oh, yeah. Okay, cool. That's fine. Go to my other data set, which is our transcripts. We talked about that one a ton today. And episode number. All right. And then I want to add. First of all, let's just see what that looks like, just so we know we haven't looked at this data set. Okay, it's a number between 1 and 23, makes sense. And then you want to add a string on the end, right? Cool. All right. I don't know what your dog's name is. Let's try Fido. Okay. Okay. Let's run that, see what we get. Ooh, got an error. Okay. What do we do when we get an error? Read the error message. Okay, cool. This spit back a bunch of stuff. Wow, this is kind of a long error message. Okay, usually the useful sentence is at the bottom. Okay, ufunc add did not contain a loop with signature matching types. Type float to none. Okay, this is a weird error message, but let's look. Float, where have we seen the word float before? Over here in our little data thing, when we look at our episode number, and it's telling us a little bit about what's in that column, it's saying float. Float is like computer speak for like a decimal number, okay? It's basically telling us the episode is a number, and it's saying add did not match type float. Okay, we know what types are, right? Type is like string or list or number. Something that it didn't match, and this is a number. So if I think about that for a second, I'm trying to add a number to a string, and I'm getting an error. Okay, this is because the type of these things isn't matching. So if I was like, okay, that seems like something might be with the type. Let me try this. Instead of adding a string, let me try adding a number. Let me see if that works. Let's add 5. Does that still give me an error? Let's run that. Think for a second. In the queue. Just want you to run. Okay, when I add a number, it runs. Okay, so interesting. It's saying type float. Okay, so when I add a number, it works. When I was adding my string, it didn't work. So something else I would test now would be, what if I add this string to, let's say, character, something else that might be a string. Okay, let's try that. If I do that, also runs. Jerry Fido, George Fido. It's like a silly name. Okay, but also runs. Okay, so my issue from before is that this was a number and I tried to add a string. So if you're running into that issue, this is where I might either Google or pull out my AI assist, like how to add string to number. Okay, if I did that, it might tell me something like this. Let's put episode number back in there. If I were to do that Google, it'd probably give me this function. I think it's called str. Let's find out if I'm right. All right, there's a function that turns something into a string, turn a number into a string. So just the, instead of the number 4, it's the string 4. And then can add text to that. Okay, so I've done that here and it's not giving me an error anymore. Still looks a little weird. Okay, maybe it's not. Okay, yeah, still looking a little weird, but it's added the string. Okay, it stopped throwing our error. Okay. I'll probably get a little fancier with like debugging this a little bit more. If I wanted to add my string to my episode number, okay. All right, just kind of the debugging process makes sense. So you read the error, you pick out as many words as you can that seem familiar. You can also paste the whole thing into Google. See, it'll tell you something like different types. Yeah, great question. Okay, did anybody else make a different column or run into an error? Anybody do anything different with columns? Okay, did anybody try writing function? Yes? No? Didn't get that far? Okay, that's okay. All right, we can come back to that. Okay. Cool. Let's talk about summarizing data frames. Okay, so far what we've been talking about is we've been either adding columns or sort of extracting information from our data frame. One of the most powerful things we can do if we're thinking about using this tool for data analysis is summarizing our data frames. Okay, if you use Excel and you're doing any kind of data analysis, one of the most common things you're doing is a formula to get a total or an average, or maybe you're doing a pivot table and you're sort of doing some subgroups so you can get a total or an average or a count, something like that. Okay, we can do all of that in Python. Anything that we can do in a pivot table, we can do in Python. And again, this we can get fancier from sort of this base. Okay. So let's look at some examples of how we can summarize data. So we can basically use some other built-in functions. Okay, these are going to be the kinds that are dot function name. Okay, as you remember, a data frame is kind of like an object, so that's why this function comes at the end. Don't worry too much about that. You'll just see some functions are here. So in this case, mean, that's another word for average, right? So I've just got my data frame, my column name, dot mean. Empty parentheses just means there's no arguments. I don't have to tell it anything. It's just going to do the mean. So let's see what that does. So I'm going to go to my ratings data. Gonna do, let's see, let's go back and check my column name. Looks like it's rating with a capital R. I'm gonna do that, and I'm gonna do this new function that I just learned about, dot mean. Okay, let's see what that spits out. Okay, I'm gonna run that. Mean 8.38. Okay, I think the ratings are out of 10. That sounds about right. Okay, I was gonna do a gut check. All right. couple other functions I can do to summarize. I can do group by. This is again very similar to a pivot table sort of thing. I could pick another column to group by and do the average of each of those. So something I might want to know about ratings is I might want to know what's the average rating for each season, right? What's the highest, which season has sort of the highest rating. So I can add, I've already got this working. Right, so I'm going to just do my data frame because I'm not going to do a specific column. I'm going to use this new function group by. Let's say what I want to group by, and then I'm going to do a mean. Okay. So I'm going to delete this, or I'll just start a new one. Okay, so I'm going to do rating data. Group by. All right. Group by is going to take a list of columns. I could potentially group by multiple columns if I wanted to. I'm just going to group by one, so it's just a list of one thing. Okay, so with my functions, it's always going to be parentheses for what you put in. And because the thing I'm putting in is a list, I'm also going to do my square brackets. And then I'm going to give it my column name, which is season. And then I'm going to do the same function I did before, which is mean. Okay, see what that gives us. Okay, great. Cool. Okay, this is interesting. So we remember from before that our data set had 170 something rows. Now it's only got 9 rows, 1 for each season. And it's actually taken the mean of every numerical column that we had. Okay, so it's for rating, it's taken the mean for each season. For the vote count, which is also a column we had, it's taken the mean for each. For this new column we added before, expand rating, which was an example, expand season, which was an example. Right, it's taken the mean of all of those for each season. Okay, for a gut check, right? Expand season was season times 10, so it should be 40 for all of season 4. It's 40 for season 4, makes sense. Okay, the purpose of printing this out is so you're kind of like gut checking that it makes sense to you. Okay, so this is pretty cool. We could save this piece of information to a new data frame if we wanted to. Right, we could call it like season info or something, and then save this. This is a data frame. And then from this, we could do anything that we've talked about earlier using this instead of ratings data as a data frame. Okay, so this is where it starts to get really powerful. You can do many, many layers of sort of analysis, summarization. You could do some like trend analysis here. You could do some more complicated statistical stuff, whatever you wanted to do. Okay. A couple other functions here. I could do like median if I wanted to. That'll go to like 8.5, I think, or yeah, 8.35 instead of 8.38, right? So all like these type of functions, if it's any function you've like heard of before, you can just Google whether it's one of these ones with the dot or not, pop it in there. There you go. Okay. All right. Okay, so we just talked about some examples. So I want you to try to find of the whole ratings table, what is the average number of vote counts? Okay, so vote count is another column that we have. Earlier, we were doing this dot mean function on a different column. Okay, so I want you to try to find the average number. You can use that dot mean function on your ratings table. Again, you can try to write a magic prompt for this, see what it gives you, see if it looks right to you. Okay, either way. All right, when you get an average rating, shout it out. Eight 8.38, okay. Boom. Oh, we did rating here. I mentioned the other one. Oh, sorry, vote count. I'm so sorry. So sorry, vote count from the ratings table. Sorry, we did rating before. You're probably very close. 1944. All right. And how'd you get there? Okay. Mhm.
Quotation, vote count,
Vote count. All right.
period, mean.
Mean. All right. Ah, there we go. All right. My brackets. Great. Sweet. All right. 1944. Awesome. Cool. I could do my same thing with median if I wanted. Just swap that out. Same deal. All right. 1800. If anybody remembers something about stats, that means it like skews something. All right, I could also do sum. I could add up all my ratings. That's a huge number. Okay, all kinds of stuff that I can do, all kinds of different functions, right? Anybody try that with magic? Anybody get magic to spit something like this out? Yeah, cool, great. Yeah, it does better on like simpler, smaller steps. Yeah, if you have a really specific, like do this one thing on this one column, it's more accurate. But your thing where it's like, make a word cloud is like, you know, that's where it tends to struggle a little bit more. Yeah. Yeah, great. So functions just by convention always have parentheses. So like for our other functions, remember we were giving it like a specific list or giving it a string. For some, there's nothing we give it, like some is just, it's like already a function. So it's just like 0 arguments essentially. Yeah, it's just empty brackets. It just tells us that it's a function. Yeah, good question. All right. Okay, so also if anybody has not tried magic yet today, try a prompt. So go to this thing, which is add a cell with magic right here, and try one of the prompts that we just did earlier in the class or something you're like wondering if it can do. Try giving it a little prompt and just seeing what it gets back. If you haven't done that, give it a try. Okay. You could give it just this prompt, right? That same prompt that you just did. See if it can do that. You can give it something we did before. You can give it something totally weird like a word cloud. Just give it a whirl. Let's see. The average rating per season in ratings data. Let's see what it does with that. Ooh. Weird. Okay, still thinking. Fun, it made me a chart. I didn't really want a chart, but it made me a chart. That's cool. When you do this, you can either hit discard or done, and then whatever it creates for you, either whether it's Python or SQL or a chart like this, you can edit from here. So I can like continue to tweak it. I'm gonna hit done. All the way back up to the top, scroll all the way back down. All right, and then I can edit this from here, right? Maybe I don't want it to be a column, maybe I want it to be a line. Maybe I don't want this chart at all. I can delete a cell over here, my ... I can delete a cell if I like have one that I don't want anymore. Whatever, I could try another prompt. I could say use Python to, or like write Python to find the average, something like that. Okay. This is some built-in visualization tools. We're going to talk about this more in the next couple of sessions. But this is another thing where like you see it's using our data frame. We could have also like done a bunch of our data manipulation, created a data frame for it to be using here. So this is where we can start to like layer these things together. Okay. I didn't really want a chart. I'm going to say, let's try this right. Python to find the average rating per season in ratings data. Let's try that, see if that gets me anything closer. Okay, it made a code cell. That's better. Okay, cool. Let's look at what it spitted out, what it spat out for this. Okay, so it made me a variable. My variable is called average rating per season. Took ratings data, my data frame, it's doing dot group by. We saw that function before, but even if we didn't, it's got a pretty like straightforward name. Okay, group by season, and then it did rating dot mean. Okay, this is very similar to I think how I wrote it before. Let's go back up and see how I wrote it. Group by season dot mean. Oh yeah, so I did group by season and then just had it do the mean of all the columns. This specifically did the rating column. So this is very similar to what I wrote, but it just did it on one column. I did it on multiple columns. And then it repeated the name here so that it would just print out, right? Because if I don't have this piece, get this out of there, and then I just run this code. It tells me that I have a variable, but it doesn't actually tell me what it is. So I could just type it again or in another cell and then run to see what it actually is. Yeah. Okay. So this one's actually pretty good. I'm going to keep that. Again, as some of you might have noticed, kind of works with simpler things. Did anybody try any other prompts? Did anybody try a prompt where you got an error just now? No? Did the thing you got make sense? Something like this, try the average or try the add a column, something like that. Sweet. Okay, cool. All right. Okay, so we touched on this a little bit before, but we've talked quite a bit about all the things that Python can do. Some of you were here last week. We talked about SQL. If you weren't here last week, SQL is sort of like an in-between step between Excel and Python is how I think of it. So in general, I would recommend to you as someone learning these tools to just start with the simplest thing that does the job every single time. Okay, so now that you know a little Python, you don't need to do everything in Python. I certainly don't. If you can do it in Excel, you should do it in Excel. Now, for the purposes of practicing, I would recommend to do your thing in Excel and then try to do that same thing in Python and like see how it maps over, right? You know what your steps are. Maybe you're doing a little formula to like add two columns together. You can come over and try to do that in Python just so you can see how it works. Okay, it's good for exercise, but in general, start with your simplest thing. This is often just Google Sheets or Excel or whatever. Okay, when you start working with large data sets, if you're doing a lot of manipulation, if you start repeating like, okay, every week I get, this report of all the downloads of all the podcasts, and then I sort it by category, and then I'm doing sums by category, and then I make this report for my boss, and then I email it to these people, right? You're doing something like that. That's a great time to try doing it in SQL, because in SQL, you can just save that query that you write, right? Similar to the code we just wrote in Python today, you can save that query, upload your new data into it every week, or have it pull from your new data every week. And it's doing all those steps. You don't have to do it manually. Okay. So especially if you start to get to the point where you're using Excel and like you have so many rows, it's hard to scroll, or like it crashes because you have too many rows, combining multiple sheets, that's a great time to switch to SQL. And when you feel like you're trying to do something complicated in SQL, that's a good time to try Python. Okay, if you don't know SQL, you can skip here and go right to Python. Some of the stuff is the same, but in general, anything that you can do in SQL is going to be a little easier to do there than in Python. Okay, the great thing about Hex, as I said before, is that you can do both. Okay, so everything that we just did here, I can do sort of operate on with SQL. So the fact that I have this data frame that I added a bunch of columns to using Python, I can now come down here, add a SQL cell. You can do this even if you weren't at the SQL class last week. I can write a very simple SQL query, which is select star from ratings data. It's like the simplest one you can get. You want to make sure, and you're right, that it's pulling from your data frames, okay, or data frames. And then I can run, and it's going to get season title, rating, whatever, but it's also going to get all the new columns that we made, right? It's got my weird title with cats column. It's got these ones where we multiplied by 10. So I did some stuff in Python. I can now come in and do whatever SQL stuff I want. I could do joins, any of the stuff we talked about last week. I can do here, or I could write some Hex magic prompt to write some SQL for me. So I can switch back and forth. I can do some stuff here, join it to some stuff, and I could do some Python on that result. Yeah. Anytime you create a new data frame, whether you do so in Python or in SQL, It'll pop up in green down at the bottom, and it'll also show up over here. So if I were doing some manipulation here, it would sort of save to this new data frame, and then I can refer to this data frame in Python if I want to. So to go back to Python, instead of ratings data, I'm just going to call data frame, let's say title with cats. And it's going to grab the column from here, right? So this is kind of how I can switch back, right? I wrote Python up here, I wrote SQL right here, I wrote Python right here. Right? You could switch back and forth. Super powerful, super cool. You can pick the right tool for the job if you're more comfortable with one or the other. Easy peasy, okay? All right. So we'll talk more about this next week, sort of some of these like strategies for like when to switch back and forth. We'll do sort of a quick like lightning refresher on SQL, lightning refresher on this, and then we'll talk about how to actually use them together a little bit more, okay? So we covered a lot of ground today, okay? So I just want to do like a quick kind of flashback through what we talked about, specifically back to our beginning here, okay? So anytime you're doing this, this also applies to SQL. What is your question, right? What is kind of our structured way of thinking about what we're about to do? That's how a lot of data work is. This even applies if you're doing stuff in Excel. Okay, what question am I trying to answer? What's my input? What data sources do I have available, or what work have I already done? And what am I trying to get to? Okay, just this alone, even without knowing very much about Python or very much about SQL, you have some idea now of what it can do, right? Some concept. I can like manipulate rows, columns, summarize, whatever. With that information and with kind of clarity on these questions, you are very well set up to write some little bits of code, to do an AI prompt and see what you get back, to Google for a function, right? This, even though it's like totally non-technical, gets you really far, along with a little tiny bit of knowledge about what either of these tools can do. Yeah. So that's what the intention is with this class, is to get you to that point where you can do a little bit of that. Again, I'm not against these tools. I think that you should use them. These are like a little controversial right now, I think. But I would encourage you to always make sure you know what it does. Okay, make sure you know what it does. Make sure you can go through line by line, whether you're writing code yourself or this way, running little bits and pieces, copying little bits out, understanding what it's doing at each intermediate step is the only way that you're ever going to be able to understand what it does. Learning to code, learning stuff like this can be very frustrating. I remember being very frustrated when I was learning stuff like this because I would get an error, and it can be hard, right? It can be hard to go from this to something that works. So the easiest thing you can do is make one little change, swap out one little thing, stick with this into Google, right? A lot of this is like kind of troubleshooting, and that's part of the process. I write code every single day at my job. I Google the error message, all right? I Google for the function. That's just like how this works. That's like part of how it is. And especially if it's like something you're doing as part of your job or occasionally or for a side project or whatever, you're definitely gonna have to do that. So just be prepared for that. That's like part of the journey, okay? So we have 2 more sessions in this series. So next week, we're gonna talk, like I said, about kind of combining these together. We'll also get into some visualization tools. There's some great ones built into Hex that are going to be similar to like a Tableau or like a Google Data Studio or some of these other tools that you might heard about or see on job descriptions. So we'll show you how to use those. There's also some visualization stuff built into Python in, you guessed it, libraries that can do stuff like that word cloud, right? Can do maps, can do more complicated charts and tables, all that kind of stuff. So we'll get into that, how to do that. As far as more resources for learning Python specifically, Hex has some great tutorials on their website, so learn.hex.tech. There are a ton of Python tutorials online. If you're gonna use those, some of them are great. I would say a lot of them start with a lot of setup. They're like, you need to install this thing and open terminal or command line. With Hex, you can actually skip all that stuff, and any commands that they're showing you, you can just type them into Hex. And sometimes some of the most frustrating thing about like getting started with one of these is those setup steps, because you're trying to set it up and those error messages are harder to understand than these, and it can just be frustrating. So if you're gonna look for any tutorial, like any like Coursera thing, whatever, just skip any of the setup and just, your Hex account is free. like do a new project, do it in there. It's going to be much easier for you and you're going to get the same results. So that would be my tip on that. That's what I do because I don't like to download stuff and do setup, and it's annoying. I don't want to do it. And if you're not, especially if you're not like a software engineer, you're not writing a whole app in Python, there's no reason to do that. Something like analysis, like we're talking about, a little bit of scripting, one-off projects here and there, like something like Hex is great. You don't have to do any setup and you can do everything that you need to do there. All right, cool. That is all I got for today. We'll give yourselves a round of applause. Most of you have never written Python before today. We've now written some, so congratulations everybody on that. That's super cool. And we'll get more into this next week. So I hope to see you all back next week if you're interested. And I'll hang out up here if anybody has any questions for minutes. Thanks so much.